Hey 951 listeners, it's your host Casey Lovell, and today's episode is awesome. That's all I can say is that it's awesome. And yes, am I a little bit biased? Probably, but this is an episode that I really think every athlete needs to listen to. And one of the reasons is because it's on the topic of sitting the bench. And I think so many athletes can relate to that in one way or another. And also, our guest speaker today is really great. She's transparent, she's honest, she's so full of wisdom. And I know that you guys are really, really going to love it. So, our guest speaker today, her name is Natalie Lawrence. And Natalie is a former collegiate athlete. She played soccer, but now she currently works for FCA, which, if you don't know, stands for Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which is awesome, awesome, awesome organization. So if you don't know about FCA, go check them out. But Natalie also started her own company called the Female Athlete Mission, or as Natalie calls it, they like to shorten it up and say the FAM, which I absolutely love. But anyway, I took an excerpt from their website where you go to their website and it says about us. And I really wanted to read that off to you in their words because I think these little couple sentences are really awesome and it tells you about them. So it says, "We are a community of female athletes who crave to talk honestly about faith and life. We want to talk about being faithful women of God on and off the field. We want to talk about the good stuff, the hard stuff, and everything in between." Guys, I love that. I love that statement right there, that about us statement. I think that is so awesome because you can just hear in that statement, it just exudes so much authenticity and community and all these things. And that's why I think what the FAM is doing to reach female athletes is tremendous, but it's also tremendously important. And so I have put all of their information below, links to their website. They have a podcast that you really need to go listen to. They have different social media pages. So I've put all those links below. And guys, seriously, go check them out. They're doing some really, really great things. And Natalie herself is doing some awesome things. So again, I put all those links, put all that information so you can just easily click the link. It'll take you to either their website, podcast, social media, whatever it is. So kind of moving on, and the topic that Natalie and I are going to be discussing in today's episode, like I said before, is the topic of I'm sitting the bench, now what? And as you can imagine, this can often be a very sensitive topic for athletes, but what I love is how Natalie just talks about this topic with such transparency and honesty that it makes you actually want to dig into it and talk about the struggles and the trials that come with being an athlete, or even just specifically with sitting the bench. And really, I encourage you to listen to topics and conversations like this ones because I think that they really challenge us to face those struggles, but to also know how to work through them, because I think our best times of learning and growth come from the struggles and the trials in life and how we work through them. I am so ready for this episode, and I hope that you all are too. So let's dive in. Natalie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I am super pumped to have you and to just really dig into the topic that we're going to talk about today, because I think it is very applicable to a lot of athletes. So, Natalie, thank you again for joining me.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes. And like I said before we even started, when you said yes, I was so excited because I've had so many great speakers on here, and I looked into your organization and love what you're doing, and I'll have you get into that a little bit more. And so, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do in your organization?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was excited to see what you guys are doing too, because we're so similar. It feels like
Yeah.
we're kind of on mission together, and I love that. So, yeah, my name is Natalie Lawrence. I live in Southern California, where I'm actually full time on staff with an organization called Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So that's kind of like my big job overview, and I do specific soccer ministry. So I played soccer in college, and that those are my people, although really female athletes are my people. So with my job in FCA, I actually started a separate organization that I kind of use as a ministry tool, but also kind of as a creative like platform and everything, called the Female Athlete Mission. And for short, we call that the FAM. And it's just an online community of female athletes talking about, life, faith, and just being an athlete. And it's been a really cool place where it kind of started as an Instagram and a blog, but now it's also evolved into a podcast, and just always looking for creative ways to kind of connect people, actually, because I really started it as I wanted it to be a community. So yeah, that's what the fam is all about, and that's kind of my thing.
Yeah. And can you tell our listeners how can they learn more about FAM? What social media are you on? Website, anything like that?
Yeah, so we are on Instagram, just Female Athlete Mission, same handle for Facebook too, at Female Athlete Mission, and then our website is actually thefamblog.com. And you can find all the links from the website, but also we're on, as for our podcast, we're on iTunes and Spotify. Just search Female Athlete Mission, and yeah, you'll find us.
Awesome. And again, I would encourage all of our listeners, go check them out, go listen to their podcast, because really what they're doing is awesome. And I really appreciate what you're doing. And obviously, I love FCA as well. Being a college athlete, was very involved in FCA in college. Actually, I joke about FCA. That's actually how I met my husband. Um, and
Love
so
it.
love FCA, and even, love what you're doing with FCA and with this, that you would go out and start this. And really, again, I have so much respect for that and for what you're doing. And I think that's really awesome. I really do.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the topic that we're talking about today, I wanted to title it, I'm sitting the bench, now what? I kind of chuckle at that because it kind of went like that in my mind in college. It's like, okay, I'm sitting the bench, now what? Like, what do I do? And so, I really just want to dig into this topic about sitting the bench and how that affects athletes, and how our faith plays a part in that, how it plays a part in how we react mentally, emotionally, all of these different things. And so let's just dive right into that. And could you tell me how, in your mind, how does sitting the bench affect players emotionally and mentally?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a player, I was in every category. I, at times, was the starter playing the whole game. Sometimes I was, sub right away. And sometimes I was sitting on the bench all game. And then other times I didn't even dress. So I feel like I've really experienced the whole spectrum. But,
Yeah.
as far as like how sitting on the bench affects us mentally and emotionally, and I would also argue, aside like physically it can affect us, is it just can
Yeah.
take a huge toll on our confidence. And I know for me that was something huge, and it was something, as a coach now, I'm just working with athletes, like as soon as they feel that as soon as you're not playing, immediately you think coaches don't believe in you, you're not good enough to be on there, and then you start to doubt yourself. And there's
Yeah.
another side of it too, where maybe you're on the bench and you're thinking, I'm good enough, I deserve to be there. And then that energy can actually turn to some anger, frustration, and resentment, which can also really affect us emotionally and then hurt the way we play. So I think physically too, when we're struggling with confidence, or we're struggling with anger, or any of those kind of extreme emotions, they can also really affect the way we play. So maybe when we do get on the field, we don't play to our potential, or maybe at practice we start to play nervous, or we start to play to try to prove something, and we might be out of control, or whatever that may be. So I think that yeah, being on the bench, like that time, allowing your brain to kind of run wild, it can take you down some paths that are not the healthiest. But I think there are a lot of things we can do and be equipped to do, whether we're someone, if you're listening and you're someone that is on the bench right now, or maybe to prepare yourself for one day if you ever are on the bench. I think there are things we really can do to kind of prepare ourselves.
I liked what you said there first of takes a huge toll on confidence. And I think that's definitely a big one of athletes, putting in the work and then feeling like, oh, I'm obviously not good enough to start or play or whatever it is. Cause I was in the same situation as you, there, like my freshman year, I sat the bench like hard. Like maybe I was going into pinch runs some, but I went from that to a full time starter. And then, so I've had both gamuts and I know how hard it is. And like you said, there's so many emotions that can come out of that, and how people react to that can be very different. And at the end there, you were talking about ways that you can kind of deal with that. So can you go into that more of different ways you can begin to overcome some of the things that you talked about?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess one other thing I would add to that first question is another thing that you might be experiencing is feelings of burnout, and even like loss of love for the sport when you're on the bench. And um, I would argue that those are feelings that you probably shouldn't trust, because if it's because you're feeling that because you're on the bench, and maybe you're saying, I'm working so hard every day at practice, and now I'm here on the bench and I'm not even getting to play, like that can definitely make you feel burnt out. And that
Yeah.
can definitely, make you question your enjoyment of playing, because maybe you're not really enjoying practices. So, and that's the only time you're experiencing your sport. And so I think it can also lead to feelings of burnout. But first, let's talk about just like the mental side of it. And I think this is shifting our mindset when we are in roles where we're already like where we are on the bench. So, first thing is realizing that you are not being set aside, you are being set apart. And a lot of times when we're on the bench, we feel set aside. We feel just like pushed aside. Coaches staring at the field, they're not looking at the bench. You feel like if I'm not in their eyesight, I'm just being pushed out of the way. Like I'm just being set aside. And I would argue that God is actually setting you apart for something, because in scripture, it's super obvious that God doesn't waste any trial. I mean, he doesn't,
Yeah.
like nothing to him is wasted. And so he is setting you apart for something. Not sure what that is. That's kind of another part of the conversation. But that first mental switch is saying, like, I'm not being set aside. I'm being set apart. I'm chosen to play this role right now. And it might mean that at some point you're going to be on the field, but regardless, you're being set apart for something. And that's way more empowering. And then once you're in that place, you can start to think through, like, what have you set me apart for, God? Then, what role can I be playing right now? What kind of teammate can I be? How can I be learning the game so that when I get on the field, I'll be better? Maybe this is going to teach me how to have conflict with a coach and be able to go into his office or her office and actually discuss these things. You're being set apart for something. Don't for a second feel that you're set aside. Second kind of mindset shift is actually I don't have a specific quote, but I'm kind of getting this from a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's written by a guy named Viktor Frankl, and he wrote a book all about like how did people survive the Holocaust. So he's like, when people are suffering the most, who are the people that survive? And I would argue that if you're struggling with being on the bench, you are suffering. Like I'm not going to minimize that. That can be a really really hard time. So I'm not in any way comparing it to what it would be like to be in the Holocaust, but more saying that I'm recognizing that it's a time of suffering. And in this book, Viktor Frankl interviews and kind of takes in all the people that survived the concentration camps in the Holocaust, and he realizes that the people that survived that suffering were not the people that were the physically strongest, not the most religious, not the ones with the biggest support group or whatever it is. The people that survived are the people that found meaning in their suffering. that found that there was purpose in the pain they were going through, that they were living for something that was bigger and greater than what was right in front of them, and that this what was right in front of them was preparing them, or building them for whatever that was. And so I think switching our mindsets to find the meaning in our suffering and our pain and our trials as an athlete
Yeah.
can give us the courage and the perseverance to keep going. And I really think that a couple of those mental switches of just finding purpose in the hard times can really help you persevere and help you realize that, you know what, maybe like maybe I'm not enjoying my sport right now, but that's right now. I still love softball. I still love soccer, whatever it is. But I'm not enjoying my time right now. Okay, then, but I still have purpose here, and go from there. Does that make sense? Those two things?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's awesome. The first thing you said there was that really it's a lot of this is in regards to shifting our mindset when it comes to your mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And you said number one there is realizing that you're not being set aside, you're being set apart. And I really, really love that, because when, especially when we are followers of Christ and we know Jesus and we've accepted him in our heart, we have this purpose that is beyond our sport. And so we know that God is setting us apart. God is setting us apart to glorify him, to play the role that he has us to play. And the second thing that you kind of added with that, you said trials are not wasted with God. And I love that, because I like to say that no failure should ever be wasted,
Hmm.
because we should be learning, we should be growing. And the same thing with God, he can use anything. Even if you don't see it in the situation, even if you think something's better, he's better, and he has a plan in that, even if we don't see it, or even if we never see it this side of heaven. And
Yes.
so loved that, and then loved what you said there when you were talking about Viktor Frankl and that quote, and the people, the ones that survive the suffering, survive the trials, and come out on the other side, they have meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Not only have they found it in their pain, they have had that meaning and purpose. They've had that hope. And again, if you're a follower of Christ, you have that hope of, I'm going to be in the presence of God one day. I wanted to, before we get to the end, jumping into some practical ways, I wanted to have you talk on faith a little bit and how faith plays a part, and you've hit on it a little bit already, but how does faith really play a part in how athletes can handle sitting on the bench?
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that aspect of finding purpose in your season of suffering. It might be, I mean, there's no greater purpose than the purpose that God has laid before us and living for him, but also
Yeah.
you may find purpose in um being, the kind of person that your family has raised you to be and that you want to be, and you find purpose in that, and that might motivate you. Finding purpose in your suffering could mean, I want to be a hardworking person, a committed person, because that's who I've raised to be, and I see my dad, my grandma in the stands, whatever, and I see them watching me, and I want to be that person for them and for me, and it might be
Yeah.
something like that too. Just kind of adding that in as a motivator. But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, when it comes to faith, a huge part of being on the bench is remembering, I say it earlier of, you're not being set aside, you're being set apart, but also that God hasn't forgotten you over there. Like, God has not forgotten you. I think sometimes you can feel forgotten, and you can feel like, well, I thought that in my sport I was here to glorify him, and when I play, and I'm not. So maybe, God just is kind of forgetting about me, and he's focusing on, Susie the star who's scoring all the goals. No, God hasn't forgotten about you. And so remembering that while you're there on the bench, in the stands, wherever you might be, that God is with you and that you're not alone, and you have someone to talk to the entire game. So you can be talking to him, you can be asking him, you can be frustrated with him, you can be closing your eyes, maybe not, because you should probably be watching the game, but you can open your hands while you're sitting there on the bench. Open your hands and just pray, like, God, I'm receiving whatever you have for me, or I'm letting go of my plans. And that He is with you can give you so much comfort and so much courage to know that you're not alone over there, even if your best friends are on the field, or if you feel like no one else understands how you're feeling or what you're going through. I can promise you that God does understand. And with that, also realizing identity. I mean, this is like the
Yeah.
classic kind of topic we go down in this, in like with this, but knowing that you're so much more than an athlete. You belong to Jesus, and that's who you are. Being a softball player is not who you are, it's something that you do. If our sport becomes our identity, when we fail in our sport, which we all will, when we're benched in our sport, which at some point we all will be, then we'll feel like we are a failure. We are a
Yeah.
benched person. And that's just not true. When you fail, that's just something that you do. It's not who you are. And so remembering that in your identity as follower of Jesus, it doesn't just mean, I think sometimes we just say like, your identity is not in softball, your identity is in Jesus. Well, that's great, but sometimes like in the moment of crisis, that doesn't, I don't know really what that means. And so what I would encourage you to do is to think of the specific identity statements that will help you in your time of need. So if you're sitting on the bench and you feel like, maybe you need to remember who you belong to, that part of your identity. So you have standing, you are with Him, like you belong to Him, and maybe that's the identity statement you need to know. Maybe something you need to know is that you've been chosen by God, and that's part of your identity. So maybe when you don't feel chosen by your coach, you can sit there and you can know, I have been chosen by God. That is a part of your identity. Maybe while you're there, you're feeling insecure about who you are, and then all of a sudden you start thinking about how you don't like what you look like. And that whole spiral of, once you
Oh,
get
yeah.
insecure about one thing, it can spiral out. In that place, then you can cling to, I am made in the image of God. I reflect the image of God Himself. Like I don't need these things to be a dignified image of Him. Like I am that because that's who I am. Find the specific identity statement in that time to cling to, because you as a follower of Jesus are so much more than just an athlete. And if you can cling to those things, you'll be able to stay in whatever place you are with your head held high without any shame. It can help take away the fears that you're having, and even the fear of what people are thinking of you on the bench, because you'll remember it. All that matters is what God thinks of you, and that identity in His eyes. So yeah, those are kind of my two things I would say as far as spiritually.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. And kind of thing that you said there at the end when you said think of specific identity statements when you're in the middle of it, probably when you're in the middle of, okay, I'm feeling down, I'm not feeling confident. What are those statements that are going to help you to remember what your identity is? And a lot identity comes up in so many of my podcasts, because especially when we're talking about athletics, it's very easy because of the time and work you put in to your sport to make it your identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's always good to go back to that, and like you said, to know God hasn't forgotten you. And if you're thinking, I liked what you said when you're like, oh, but I want to be glorifying God, and I thought I was going to be doing that on the field. And I kind of like made a note, you can glorify God on the field, but you can also glorify God on the bench. We
Exactly.
should be glorifying God everywhere and in everything we do. So again, knowing that your sport is not your identity, and part of the reason it shouldn't be is because it's not going to last.
Yeah.
Like everything in this life, it's temporary. And so you talked before about a few practical things that you had. Can you now kind of go into some of those practical things that athletes can practice? And you did mention one with having those specific identity statements, but can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, yeah. And with those identity statements, maybe that does take a little bit of time now. maybe make a list of, you can even Google it, who am I in Christ? And pick out 4 or 5 things. And those could be like your mantras. Maybe you put that in the middle of your locker or the door of your locker, so that before you go into a game, before practice, maybe you're struggling in practice too, just not feeling like the coach is seeing you and you're not getting the reps or whatever, that you're not in, when they split up the scrimmage and you're not on the starting squad or whatever it is, for you to cling to an identity, that those are there, that you can memorize, that you can see before every practice, every game. That's a great practical thing. So as far as practical, I would say, so I'm going to take us through kind of a scenario of actually the beginning of a game, because I think sometimes, I don't know how it is in softball exactly, but with soccer, sometimes you don't know who's starting and who's playing until the game. So maybe it's in the locker room right before the game, or it's literally, you're on the field and coach starts giving you the lineup. Well, in that moment, that's where I want to start, where you don't hear your name called. And that split moment, you might want to be upset. You might feel the burning of tears on your eyes. You might be feeling the like kind of rage in your chest. You might be feeling totally numb because you're like, okay, another game. Well, in
Mhm.
that moment, I don't want you to think about how you're feeling and what's going on. That can happen after the game. You have the rest of your day, night, tomorrow, the next day to kind of process through how you're feeling. In that moment, when you don't hear your name, the next thought, the next decision has to be, okay, then what role am I going to play today? Because you have a role. Remember, you can glorify God whether you're on the field or you're not. Right away, I want you to start thinking about practical things you can do. Maybe you're like, wow, a freshman's playing above me. Okay, I want to cry right now, but you know what? She's probably freaking out too that she's playing. So I'm going to go I'm going to go encourage her. And it might be hard, but I'm setting aside, my feelings right now, and I'm going to encourage her. Maybe it's just cheering at the top of your lungs. Maybe it's a specific girl that you're going to talk to. Maybe you're going to pray for someone on the bench. Not sure how that's going to play, but you have a role. Figure out what that role is going to be during the game. Um, that's my first thing. Then, well, actually, I'll say this too. I want you to be free to be angry. Like, I'm not talking about this on this podcast to say like, hooray, you're on the bench, like just be happy and stay there. I'm an athlete and I want you to know that as someone that maybe you're not getting playing time right now, like I want you to work to get playing time. I don't want that to be your goal to be a bench warmer, but I want you to be able to find joy and purpose being there when you are there, but eventually like I'm encouraging you, like, it's okay to not be okay with that role in the
Absolutely.
long run, to want to be the person on the field. We're competitors. So I want to encourage you never to blame the coach for you being on the bench. Blame the decision and be frustrated at the decision that the coach made, but don't be frustrated at the coach, him or herself. And the reason why is if you start to blame the coach and get frustrated with the coach and blame and make everything on him, you're going to begin to build resentment and anger and emotion at your coach. And you will no longer be able to be in a relationship where the two of you can work together to get you to be on the field. It's going to be a you versus them thing. And I can promise you, as a player and as a coach, that is one of the worst places you can be, because that's not the point of a coach, right? They're not supposed to be against you. They're for you. They're for the team. But as soon as you start to build and blame them for everything that's going wrong, it will begin to cause a divide between the two of you, and you won't be able to love God and love them in the process, which is ultimately, our purpose. So if you can get to a place where you're frustrated with the decision, not at the coach, and the game ends, I want you to give yourself 24 hours before you do anything. Okay, do not talk to your coach within 24 hours of the game about your playing time. And here's the perfect example. When I was growing up, I was probably like 15. I was playing on a club soccer team, and I wasn't getting playing time. And my dad went to talk to the coach right after the game. And I'm not saying this to encourage you to get your parents to talk to your coach by any means, but my dad went to go talk to the coach about my playing time. And so he kind of followed him into the parking lot. My coach started to get all defensive. My coach thought my dad wanted to fight him. I have no idea why. Well, I know, right? But I think that like the fact is like emotions are flowing when it
Yeah.
comes to game.
Oh
Like
yeah.
game times, you're emotional, parents are emotional, coaches are emotional. Let 24 hours to calm everything down. It might even be 48 hours if like after a day you're still feeling very emotional. You have to be self-aware, but give that time like of buffer for everyone to cool down and be able to see things objectively. Before then, you're able to go into the coach's office and you can then talk to the coach about the decision that he or she made. Not talk to them about what kind of person they are or, why they made the wrong decision. Talk about the decision. Because if you do that, remember that puts yourself in a position where you're on the same
Yeah.
team as the coach. You're not against them. So I want to encourage you, have conversations with your coach. Don't put yourself on an island. Start having conversations. Maybe it's an assistant coach too. Maybe it's a strength trainer. Maybe the coach eventually ends up saying something you can work on is your strength, and that's something that I would love to see. And I think that could get you more on the field or whatever it is. But don't isolate yourself. Take the time to then get people to be on your team and do that together to get yourself on the field. So that's kind of like a three-step process, but I want to encourage you, like, I don't want you to stay on the bench. I want you to want to be on the field. So
Yeah.
those are some tips.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said there in the beginning when you said actually thinking about, okay, what role am I going to play? Or maybe how has God equipped me with specific skills that while I am on the bench or not getting as much playing time, what has God equipped me with that I can do really well? So I'll take an example from college. We had people, we had one player when she was playing on the bench. And again, like you said, you should want to be on the field. Everyone should want to be on the field. There's nothing wrong with that. You wouldn't be there if you weren't a competitor, and you still need to continuously work hard for that. But it's like when you're on the bench, especially during games, how can you play that role? And we had someone, and she was a really great encourager to other players and complimenting them when they did well, things like that. But it's like, how can you play a role? And even if that role, a big role, especially if you're on the bench, that you need to focus on, because you should also be concerned about how well your team's doing. You should want your team to be winning, even if you're not out there, because you contribute every day. In practice, your role could be, I'm going to work as hard as I can, because that pushes the starters and it
Mm-hmm.
makes them better. And it's obviously only going to make you better. So, what are different roles? Can you be a mentor? What are these things that you can do? And actually thinking on that. And I chuckled because I've coached some teams as well. I coach, individuals, but I've coached in a team setting as well. And when you talked about never blaming the coach, more of blaming the decision. And I chuckled because I could hear my dad in my head saying, anytime growing up when I would complain about either, not playing or whatever it was, pretty much if I complained about anything, and he was like, okay, well, then what are you going to do about it? If you're not playing, how can you improve yourself? How can you grow? Like you said, even if that's talk, sitting down with a coach, having a respectful conversation, saying either, I don't understand why I'm not playing. Could you talk to me about that? Or what can I do to maybe earn a starting spot? And, sometimes it's just there's people above you and you haven't gotten to that point yet, but being able to let that kind of fuel you and have you work hard, because you should be working hard. As being a starter should be your goal. And I think sometimes when we get mad at the coach, it's kind of just an excuse. We're angry. Maybe we do know that we could be doing more or working harder. And so we're angry and we kind of want to point that at someone else. I've been there. We
Yeah.
kind of want to point that at someone else and take the focus off ourselves and what we can do, because it's easier than focusing on really what we need to work at. And, even if you think, I really do deserve a spot, and maybe you do, okay, what can you do about that? You can go to the coach, you can have a respectful conversation. But again, like you said, being more focused on the decision, not the person, because you can't control what they do anyway. And then the last thing you hit on was that you were talking about how if you are emotional, don't try to approach your coach. I put a note, and it's that emotion doesn't really leave room for logic a lot of the times. And
Totally.
so when we're emotional, I would agree with that. Don't probably go to the coach and approach them and try to, talk things out in your emotional, because I can say if I would have ever done that, it wouldn't have gone it wouldn't have gone well for me.
Yeah.
So I really like all those things you said there. I think athletes can really grab onto those and use those practically.
Yeah, yeah, and a great you mentioned this, but a great thing to ask yourself really is what can you control? Because especially in that moment when you're not on the starting lineup or you're not on you don't get to play, that's not your decision. Like that is their decision and there's nothing you can do about it. So what can you control in that moment? If you focus on the things you can't control, like and you're focusing on those things changing, you're going to drive yourself absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And it's really exhausting and draining and just, it's a waste of time and energy. So think in that moment, what can I control? Well, I can control my attitude. I can control now how do I use my gifts in another way? You can control what you're going to do after the game. And I think those are really, that can be really empowering too, to remember that there are still things in your control.
Yeah.
I know for me, when I was a senior, there was a girl that never passed that fitness test and so she didn't play. And she really struggled passing it. But here's the thing, like that was something she can control. That's one, if you're not playing because you're not passing the fitness test, that's one thing where you say, okay, I need to work on the thing I can control.
Mm-hmm.
Look in the mirror and decide, like, is this something that's in my hands? I'm going to do what I can do. Well, long story short, this girl ended up getting an injury. I think because she was working so hard to pass and she hadn't prepared well enough in the summer. So she was permanently on the bench for the rest of the season. And she ended up being like my personal encourager because I was having chronic foot issues, but I was still playing through it. And before every game, I would be just like, worried about my feet. And she came and she had a Sharpie in her bag. She would come over to me and she, every single game, drew mountains on my wrist and said, "Move mountains today. You can do this, Natalie." And I just got chills thinking about it. Like she got me through that season because she
Yeah.
controlled what she could control. She decided, I can't play. Like that's completely out of my control now. But I know that, my senior captain needs me. And I'm not going to look down on myself because I'm a freshman. I'm going to actually be used here and encourage her. And it was a game changing season for me. So that's a great example. So just think, what can I control and step into that with wherever you are, even at practice and, everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And again, that's a great focus to have, because that's really the only focus you should have. And that goes with just life in general, because again, you can only control what you can control. And there's no use in dwelling on the things you can't control, even though easier said than done. I
Exactly.
know that I do that as well. So, Natalie, thank you for all of the great things you've talked about. And you talked about your story some in there, and faith, and even gave athletes practical ways. So the way you talk and the passion you have about it, I love that. And I think athletes can, again, really take a lot away from what you've said and learn from it, especially from the perspective of someone who was an athlete and is now coaching and still involved in sports. I think that that's such a good viewpoint to come from too, because you're kind of seeing it on both sides, especially with this topic. So, Natalie, thank you again so much for joining me on the podcast. It was really so great to have you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And if anyone is struggling with this and resonated with something I said, like DM me on Instagram. It's most likely will be me responding and we can talk through it or talk through your unique situation or whatever it is. Just know that you're not alone. And yeah, we're here with you. And I love this podcast. I love what you're doing, Casey. Keep it up.
Hey everyone, and thank you so much for listening to the 951 podcast. But before you go, Please subscribe to our channel and follow us on social media. And then tell all your friends, teammates, or really whoever you want to listen to the 951 podcast so that they can be ignited in their sports and faith journey.